Welcome to the second edition of Charities Corner. Today we will be talking about regulatory compliance. As of right now, we are streaming from multiple sites. We are on LinkedIn, uh, YouTube. Uh, we're on many sites. You should be able to find us on Facebook and Twitter as well. Well, what is now known as X. So, and as I said, my name is Charity Ponton, and today we have Mike Shin with us, and we're going to start by letting Mike tell you who he is. Hi, Mike.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Shin. I'm the CEO for Atomic Corp, and I'll be very brief. I have quite a bit of background in regulations, particularly on the cybersecurity side. I actually helped develop some federal regulations for cybersecurity and built the inspection programs around that, specifically in the nuclear industry. So feel free to ask any questions you might have about particularly the process on the federal side for creating and publishing regulations and how that translates actually to the private industry.
Thank you, Mike. And QA compliance is actually a very in-depth thing, so we're happy to have your knowledge on that. It has a wide playing field encompassing data security, privacy, healthcare, and for global enterprises, geographic requirements. Is there some sort of foundational standard an organization can use to build a compliance solution that can cover all of these?
Yeah, there is. Probably a good idea to kind of start from the philosophy of how different regulatory frameworks may work, and why sometimes the answer for that is definitively absolutely yes, go do this, and sometimes the answer is, well, you kind of have to figure it out, and here's the best guess that we have right now to keep this regulator happy. So I'll start with what are the two different types of regulations and frameworks that are out there, and that largely boil down into two groups: prescriptive and performance-based. What this basically means is that a prescriptive regulation or framework tells you exactly what you need to do. Go build a wall 10 feet tall and paint it blue. An example of that is PCI DSS. PCI DSS, at least the current version of it, is prescriptive. It tells you exactly what you need to do. Go get this technology, implement a firewall, encrypt these files, and so on. So you know precisely what it is that you need to do to be in compliance. Performance-based regulations don't tell you precisely what to do. They tell you what the regulator wants you to achieve. So an example that I like to use is, go bake me a delicious cake. I'm not going to tell you how to bake the cake. I'm not going to tell you what flavor the cake is. I'm not going to tell you how big it is, because you're a chef. So you know how to make a cake. You're going to go bake a cake. You're going to bring it to me. I'm going to have a bite of it, and I'm going to tell you if it's delicious. The downside to performance-based regulations is just that, right? It's sometimes in the eye of the beholder. What is delicious? Examples of that would be GDPR, HIPAA, even the nuclear regulations in the United States are performance-based. So maybe thinking to yourself, well, that sounds pretty terrible. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these approaches. So prescriptive frameworks, the advantages are it's a cookie cutter. It's very easy to comply with, right? It tells you what you're supposed to do. You have to have a firewall. You have to have antivirus. You have to do this. You have to do that. You have to configure this way. The disadvantage of that is, first of all, it's not flexible, right? You have to do it this way. If you don't, you're not in compliance. It's also not as adaptive to new threats. In other words, I have to have a firewall. Well, what if a firewall is no longer effective for the threat that I'm defending against? What if it needs to be, I don't know, air gapped, right? Let's say we're dealing with the systems that launch nuclear missiles, right? We probably don't want those to be accessible from the internet. But if our prescriptive framework says I have to have a firewall, then I've got to connect those networks together, and maybe I don't want to do that. And lastly, even from a government operations perspective, the downside to prescriptive frameworks is that they can interfere with innovation. So you might want to do something new or unique, or you might want to use some new technology. You may not be able to do that. The prescriptive framework may not allow you to do that. So on the one hand, it's much easier to comply with. You know what you need to do to be compliant. There's no question. You don't have to worry that you're not going to be compliant. The downside is that may interfere with the operation of your business. And this is one of those cases where compliance does not equal security. Being compliant may not mean that you are protected against the threats that you're exposed to. So you need to keep that in mind. For compliance, it's not like you have a choice. You have to do it. But it's also important to understand what the outcome is that you're going to get from that. So performance-based regulations, the advantages are it's very flexible, it's very adaptive, and you can run your business as you want to, as long as you're compliant. But that's the downside. It's not a cookie cutter. Somebody's telling you, go bake a delicious cake. It's up to you to prove that you're compliant. Sometimes a regulator may be able to give you guidance about how to be compliant. So an example of that is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will put out something called a regulatory guide, which is one way to be compliant. So in other words, it's if you do it exactly like this, yes, you'll be compliant. But we're not telling you you have to do it exactly like this. That doesn't always happen. Regulators don't always do that. And the downside is to putting out one acceptable way is that it may in fact not be adequate, right? It may be, again, a case where you're compliant, but you're not secure. Regulators like performance-based approaches to cybersecurity because it makes it more adaptive, because the regulatory process is extremely slow. I cannot emphasize how slow the process is. On the one hand, that's kind of good. You don't want the law changing so often that, next year you're not compliant anymore. But for a rapidly moving target like cybersecurity, regulation that's highly prescriptive is not going to be able to keep up with what the bad guys are doing. So an example of that is, for advanced threats, classic antivirus software is no longer adequate. Right? We're supposed to use, application whitelisting, for example, as opposed to antivirus software. But if we had a regulation that said you must use antivirus software, and the bad guys have figured out a way to defeat that, even though all the industries that I'm regulating are compliant, they're no longer secure. So the downside from shall we call it sort of a cultural perspective, or maybe from a governance or national security perspective, is that regulations are a very slow, plodding process that really can't keep up with the current threats. So the regulators prefer, and really should, write performance-based regulations, but that makes it much harder for you to comply. GDPR, HIPAA, those are examples of where you are obligated to figure out what the bad guys are doing, and you need to keep up with those threats, because if you get compromised, that's evidence that you're not in compliance.
Okay, well, that was definitely a good base, a good foundation. It's a little intense because it can differ from company to company. So,
And it should, especially for a performance-based regulation. If we're manufacturing cars, the kinds of things we need to do to operate our business may be very different if we're a business that's a publisher, right? We publish books. So, we can't expect every security program is going to fit perfectly in every organization. So this is just an example. So GDPR, no, go ahead. I'm going to have a
no,
sip.
it's okay. I'm ready for the example. I am absolutely ready. Hit me with it.
So GDPR doesn't tell you what it is that you're supposed to do. So it's up to you to demonstrate compliance. And, that means you've got to go find other frameworks that might satisfy those requirements. And here's an example of a couple that other folks in the industry have looked at and said, all right, if you apply these 32 controls from ISO 27001, or these 17 controls from 800-171, that helps to satisfy these 14 requirements from GDPR. The downside is if you don't have a regulator that's telling you in a prescriptive way, go do this and you'll be compliant, it's up to you, and it's up to the industry, and it's up to the rest of us to try and figure out how to achieve those goals. And as violations occur and as fines go out, the EU will put out interpretations. That we all may think this particular control implemented in this way is adequate, and somebody will have an incident, and the EU could say, no, that's not adequate. You need to do this. So, performance-based regulations are a moving target for all of us that have to be in compliance with them as well.
And beyond these foundations, what are there any certain software capabilities that you need to have in order
Yeah.
to? Okay.
Yeah. So it's a great question. So, these are the inhibitors that you have with compliance, right? Insufficient observability, not knowing what your vulnerabilities are, not being able to audit, not having in-depth reporting, staff skill, budgetary challenges, new technologies, hybrid cloud, and so on. These are all challenges that you really need technology to help you with. Now, something to keep in mind is that all these frameworks include things you need to do beyond what can be accomplished with technology, but you can use technology to help manage your programs. So becoming compliant is important to understand where you're not compliant. So there's really two types of software that we can use to become compliant. One is to measure our compliance or manage it, whatever word you prefer to use. But basically, we need tools to help us figure out what we're not doing so we know what to do. Particularly if we're, as is often the case these days, where we have to comply with multiple frameworks. So you might have to comply with, let's say you're a healthcare provider, you've got to comply with HIPAA, and you take credit cards a lot. You got to comply with PCI DSS. And let's say you're also dealing with patients from the EU. So you also have to deal with GDPR. And you have Gamma knives in your hospital. So you also have to deal with nuclear regulations and so on. So you have lots and lots of regulations going on. So first and foremost, you need good tools to help you try and figure out, where your, issues are that you need to fix. And then you need tools to implement compliance, because many of these things require purpose-built software, specific appliances, and what have you to meet those compliance requirements. So, for example, PCI DSS requires you to have a firewall. Who doesn't? But you got to go buy a firewall, right? You got to have something to do that, to meet that requirement.
So there are many different components that go into compliance as a whole. And
Yes.
I just off topic, Mike, your mic is staticky a little bit at the end.
Oh boy.
So if we could tune that just a tad so we can hear
see.
everything.
How's that? Is that better?
It just seems when you get passionate, it just kind of spikes at the end there.
Interesting. Well, I turned off their automatically adjust mic volume, so hopefully that
Okay.
makes it better.
We'll work with it.
If not,
thank you.
Yeah. So for compliance measuring, right, you really need technology to help you figure out where your gaps are, because some of these frameworks are very, very, very detailed. So here's an example of a Windows computer and the many, 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 many settings that have to be changed from a default Windows configuration. This isn't to pick on Microsoft, but an out-of-the-box Windows computer for this particular framework is only 32% compliant. There's still a whole slew of things that you have to do to the system to meet this framework. Now, this is a prescriptive framework. So as I said, the upside for a prescriptive framework is you know exactly what it is that you need to do. But you may have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of little things that you may need to do. And keep in mind, a prescriptive framework isn't necessarily driven by a regulator or a third-party entity. A prescriptive framework could be a combination of those and internal policies. Maybe your department in a larger company and they've got a whole slew of additional security requirements that they want you to meet. Or you're in a federal agency and like DoD, for example, and you've got STIGs that specify a whole bunch of things that you need to do to a computer to make it compliant with their security requirements. You're going to need technology to be able to figure out what that is. And this is just one example. You can see, it just goes on and on and on for page after page after page. And this is just a Windows computer. This isn't any high level thing. It's just how do you make a Windows desktop compliant with this particular framework.
That is really, really interesting. So, from my understanding, there are 9 control requirements. Have we gone over all of those? Audit process tools, non-repudiation of users,
Hmm.
review, update of events, audit process failure alerts. Um, Anything else that are specific?
Yeah, so in most of the frameworks that are out there, there are several common themes for auditing and accountability. And for everyone's benefit, auditing is in the cybersecurity context, not in the CPA context or maybe in the Scientology context. It's auditing, as in keeping records that can't be modified by the user. Something that we can go back to see what has happened on that system. And really, the big one is that you need technologies that create a concept called non-repudiation. What that means is that users can't deny that they did something. We know that they did it because the data is stored and protected and captured in a manner that prevents it from being tampered with by that user. And there's a whole slew of sub things that accomplish that. But that concept of non-repudiation is key to really all of these frameworks because they all want you to demonstrate that you're able to prove that you're meeting the security requirements and also that you know what your users are doing and that if something bad happens, you can go back and review it. Common sense, really. But this is not something that is enabled by default in the technologies that we all use. So, these are things you have to turn on. These are things you need to buy solutions or implement open source solutions, whichever you prefer, to accomplish this. And on top of that is that you actually have to review these events. So it's not enough to capture the data. All of the various frameworks that are out there require you to actually look through them and determine whether or not something bad has occurred or something unauthorized happened or somebody made a mistake. It's not uncommon to see a case where someone has bought like a SIM technology, for example, and they're collecting all of this data, but they don't look at it. And I get it. We all have jobs to do and whatnot, and that can be an enormous amount of data to go through. The other things you need to be able to do is you have to know if this process fails. I know that kind of sounds like common sense, but it's not good enough to, well, think of it like doing computer backups, right? So for anybody who's been around a while, the typically where the process fails is not that you weren't doing backups, it's that you didn't actually test the backups, right? You didn't, when you actually have an accident, you go to use your backups, they're either faulty or they're not backing up what you want, or maybe you don't have the right software to recover it or whatever the case may be. So if you're not actually being alerted in this case that the auditing process has failed, then you'll find out that it wasn't working and you're not in compliance. I know, again, this kind of sounds like a no-brainer, but this is a big deal, right? A big enough deal that in some frameworks, if the auditing system fails, the system is required to shut itself down. That's how big of a deal it can be in some cases. And in some cases that's absurd. I mean, what if your plane turned off its its fly-by-wire system because the auditing failed, right? We can't always do that, but it at least helps to emphasize how important this is as its own standalone concept. If the auditing process fails, something has to happen immediately, either to prevent that from being taken advantage of by the adversary, or that some human being is notified such that they can take corrective actions quickly enough so that we don't lose that auditing data. Record reduction. So this is a big deal too. This is really just a human factor issue. There's too much data coming in from all these systems. If you're expecting a human being to review it, then you need some way to reduce that data down to something that a human being can handle. Otherwise, you get what sometimes is called alarm avalanche, which means there's so many alerts and alarms and everything going on that we don't have the ability to respond as a human being. There's just too much noise. And last but not least is that there has to be a mechanism to ensure the integrity of the data is preserved. That is, It can't be tampered with by an adversary or whomever, and that it's protected. We might lose the data because we have a fire or the hard drives fail or someone accidentally deletes the data and whatnot. So there's open source solutions out there that can do all of this. OSEC is a great example of that, and it's free. So if you're not already accomplishing these core auditing and accountability controls that nearly every framework calls for and any cybersecurity program should have, there are free solutions out there that you can use, like OSEC right now, that will do that for you. And that's a huge part of any cybersecurity program. If you're not doing at least this, then you don't have visibility into what's going on. You won't have the ability to review and figure out what happened if you have an incident. You won't be able to do hunting. You won't be able to do a lot of this stuff. And you certainly won't be in compliance with many regulations and certainly any of the major frameworks that are out there.
What are the main components of OSEC that would help with compliance specifically?
Yeah, so it showed, the compliance scanner. So OSEC has compliance scanning built into it. Again, this is just an example of Windows, but you can see some of the other frameworks that are in there. It's got frameworks for nearly every operating system. These are just a few of them. All of the various Linux distributions, Windows, even legacy Unix platforms. There's compliance frameworks built in there. So like AIX, for example, where there are third-party frameworks like CIS, OSEC supports that, which is nice because sometimes the challenge that you can run into as a security person, especially when trying to get budget to mitigate some of these issues, is, well, why should I believe that this is a problem? And if you've got a third party, in this case CIS, saying, yeah, this is an appropriate security benchmark for this platform, it's not your opinion as a cybersecurity person or your opinion as an auditor or a consultant or whatever role you're in. It's very helpful to be able to point to a credible third party and say, well, these folks clearly know what they're doing and they say this is a problem and we need to mitigate it because it's a universally accepted benchmark or standard or whatever the case may be. So this is something OSEC can do, and again, it's open source, right? So if you're not already doing this, then go grab it, right? There's a solution for you to be able to do this right now. The other thing that OSEC can do for you is vulnerability assessments, which really more people are probably familiar with. This is an example of an out-of-the-box, I think this is a Red Hat, or it might be a CentOS computer. I'd have to look a little bit further. But, this is the other piece of it that particularly inspectors, auditors, regulators kind of key in on really quickly because everybody understands vulnerabilities, and you need to understand them too, right? You need to know what your vulnerabilities are. You also need to be able to do your own homework because sometimes a vendor will not fix a vulnerability, and the software is still vulnerable, but the vendor may say, I didn't dig into this one too much, but the vendor might say, well, the way that we use this particular software doesn't expose that vulnerability, or that feature isn't turned on. So even though that library has this bug or vulnerability in it, these things aren't turned on by default. So, you got to do your own homework, sadly. So sometimes the vulnerability is there, but maybe it's not on your system. Maybe it's not configured that way. OSEC's really good at that. It's tied into the NVDs and the ovals that vendors put out, as well as NIST, MITRE publishes. And you can drill down and see, does this really apply in my case? And it might. Maybe the vendor has said, yeah, we're not going to patch this because this isn't turned on by default, but you're using that feature. You need it. So that vulnerability does apply to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We are accepting questions from anybody who may be watching at this time. So feel free to comment with a question as we continue our discussion. Is there anything else in regards to OSEC specific or maybe NIST? Hello?
So I've got a question here. I'll
Oh,
see if
okay.
I can answer it. Uh, so so I don't work with the domestic nuclear industry in the United States anymore. So I think I can probably answer this more clearly. So we've got a question here about whether or not someone can bypass their diode. So for everyone's benefit, I'll be very brief. The nuclear industry has implemented some unique technologies. A diode is what it sounds like, kind of bit of a slang term, but not necessarily. There are products out there that transmit data unidirectionally, and they do it through physics, light in this particular case. A data diode has a transmitter and a receiver. And this is done to ensure that through the physics of light, that data can only move in one direction. So the nuclear industry has implemented these data diodes to isolate certain systems in their nuclear power plants from access externally. Systems where they need to get data, like maybe a safety system that tells them what the temperature of something is, or the pressure. But you don't want somebody to be able to interfere with that or connect directly to it. So the correct answer to that is you'll need to ask the regulator. This is one of those cases where it depends, right? This is why performance-based regulations are tough, because somebody like me might say, sure, here's how you can do that and you won't get in trouble. But it really doesn't matter what my opinion is. It ultimately matters with all of these performance-based regulations, whether or not the regulator agrees with you. And that could potentially change. I mean, that's unfair. The regulators that I've worked with have been pretty good about not trying to move the goalposts. If they say something is good, they tend to not. It's not so much that they change their minds, it's that they don't want to pull the rug out from underneath you. But that's not always the case. Some regulators change their minds. The ATF, for example, has put out opinions on something saying, yes, if you build a thing this way with these features, it's legal for you to own it. And then later they changed their mind and said, no, we don't agree with that. Or maybe Congress slightly changes a law and it gives that regulator more purview to change their mind. So the short answer to that is you need to ask the regulator, but it's also unusual for a regulator to want to answer definitively. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. We used to call that "bring me a rock." What do you want, Mr. Regulator? And the regulator says, "Bring me a rock." And you bring them a rock, and they're like, "No, that's not the right kind of rock." So that's the downside for performance-based regulations, is that there isn't always a good answer. Safety in numbers is kind of the right answer. So if everybody in your industry is doing something a particular way, you should probably stick to that. But your whole industry also could be wrong. It's really can be challenging sometimes with performance-based regulations. My advice would be just do the right thing. And by that, what I mean is don't try to find a way around the spirit of a regulation if you want to stay in compliance. Try to be proactive and demonstrate intent that you're not trying to be maliciously compliant with the regulation, maybe is a nice way to put it, that you're invested in success, and that you don't want whatever this thing is that this regulation is trying to prevent, you don't want that to occur. And you usually have better success if you make a mistake with a regulator than arguing the point, especially with performance-based regulation.
That was a good question. I don't see any other questions on my side. I'm not sure about you, Mike, if you see any.
I've got a question. I'm looking at my Slack, so I'm getting some questions from
Good.
folks on Slack. So I've got a question here about vulnerability management. Why do some vendors not patch vulnerabilities? It's the answer is kind of long, but I'll give you the shortest possible answer that I can. For the vendors that are trying to do the right thing, they may not patch a vulnerability because they feel that it either isn't relevant to the typical or default configurations of their platforms, or they may not understand the vulnerability well enough. I'm trying to think of other scenarios. I know I've talked about this before in other presentations. For someone who's not trying to do the right thing, this used to be a bigger issue many years ago, where vendors would say things like, that's a hypothetical vulnerability. Maybe they don't want to fix it. Well, it costs money, takes time. Maybe they don't like the person or the personality of the person. Typically though, when I see organizations that aren't patching vulnerabilities, vendors, it's usually because they just don't understand the vulnerability. It's way above their head. This happens more often than not with things like control systems, things that are built by people that you wouldn't typically think of as IT technologists. It's not that they're not working with modern technology. It's just that they're not really exposed to it in the same way that maybe someone is that's a DevOps engineer that's building something in AWS. This person's building a SCADA or control system to turn a pump on, and the type of customer that they're dealing with and the peers in their environment and the business requirements that they have may not be informed by any of the kind of threats that you would be exposed to on a daily basis in an environment like AWS or GCP, or even just the peer groups that you're in. So that's typically what I've seen for vulnerabilities that don't get patched, is that you more often than not have a vendor that just doesn't understand the vulnerability. Really, the last more rare category is it may not be possible. Platform simply may not be able to support whatever that mitigation is. Control systems, for example, may not have, seen this actually happen in real life, not enough memory for the fix, or maybe the thing is simply too slow or lacks the processing capability. Maybe your crypto cipher is vulnerable, and crypto cipher that isn't is just going to eat up too much CPU. In short, it's on you as the user to do your homework. If a vendor says there's no vulnerabilities in something, that's, first of all, there's no possible way they can prove that. But I would not accept that at face value. I would do my own homework. I would use third-party tools to look at what the platform has. But I'd read the CVEs too. Like I said, sometimes, like in the case of the window I showed earlier, you'll have cases where there's vulnerabilities in things, and the vendor hasn't patched them for one reason or another. Maybe they just feel they're not exploitable, or the default configuration doesn't provide a pathway for the adversary to attack it. But in your case, maybe it does. So you've got to do your own homework.
Do you see any more questions, or are we
scrolling through my Slack here? Some of these you can take offline. Some of these answers are going to be way too long.
Okay.
Especially if we're trying to keep to 30 minutes.
Well, that's okay. I mean, they can always go to the Atomic website and look at the white papers and the blogs and the videos and get a little bit more in depth. They can also, if they would like, they can request a demo of the Atomic OSEC from the website as well, if they're interested in giving that a try and seeing if it works for them. Is there anything else you'd like to close us out with, Mike?
That's all great. I think in addition to that, if anybody has any questions or needs any help getting compliant, feel free to reach out to us. We have a Slack space that's open to the public. You can hop on our Slack and ask us in real time. We'll do our best to try and help you. Especially for these performance-based regulations, it's a real challenge. It's not as simple as I'm just going to buy some products and deploy it and I'll be fine. It's really on you to understand your environment, to understand the unique risks of your environment, the unique pathways, everything about your environment is going to be unique, and it's up to you to ensure that you don't have events, you don't get hacked. Because if you do, then that's pretty clear evidence that you're not in compliance with the regulation. So, ask. Don't be shy. Know that for most of the stuff that's out there, even the prescriptive stuff, people struggle all the time trying to figure out what do we need to do, what's adequate, what's not adequate, is this going to solve the problem? Don't fall into the trap of thinking that it's, I'm just going to throw a few pieces of cybersecurity technology at it and we'll be okay. Nothing bad's going to happen and no one's going to notice. That's even worse. If you've purposely decided not to do what you are required to do and then an event occurs, the consequences are even more severe than if you did your best and you tried and you failed versus you purposely didn't try. So ask, we're happy to help out, and you're not alone. Just know that.
That's a good ending. You're not alone. Everybody's struggling with it. So I wanted to say thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for spending some time here with us. We appreciate it. I also want to say thank you to everybody who joined us live, and thank you to everybody who is watching this recorded. There will be another Charities Corner probably in January 2024. So Happy New Year. And if you're interested in trying the system that you saw today with the UI interface, then Atomicorp does offer a 14-day free trial. So do not hesitate to reach out, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.